Good evening. My name is Dr. Cassandra Hawkins. I am an MFA student here in Southern Studies. Good evening, and welcome to our visiting documentary series. Tonight, we are honored to present a special screening of Lowndes County and the Road to Black Power, followed by a wonderful question and answer session with its co-director, Mr. Sam Pollard, and myself. Mr. Pollard is a veteran feature film and television editor, as well as documentary producer and director. Released on Peacock in December 2022 and is available now, Lowndes County and the Road to Black Power spotlights the grassroots fights for voting rights and Black Power in Lowndes County, Alabama, which is located between Selma and Montgomery, Alabama. This documentary includes first-person interviews, archival footage, and the efforts of local activists and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. Mr. Pollard's most recent project, South to Black Power, premiered on HBO in the fall of 2023. That film features Charles Blow, New York Times columnist, and is inspired by Blow's book, The Devil You Know, a Black Power Manifesto. Tonight's event is made possible by the Berkeley Hudson Visiting Documentary Fund. We hope you find this film very enlightening and thought-provoking. After the screening, Mr. Pollard will join us in a conversation about these narratives and the continuing relevancy of the fight for inequality. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Sam Pollard. So my first question is about the historical impact. Lowndes County has a powerful civil rights legacy that's always in the public eye. What fresh perspectives and untold stories did you hope to highlight by revisiting the past of Lowndes County, Alabama?
Well, I would say not many people knew the story of Lowndes County. I mean, I had worked in lots of civil rights films and documentary films, and I didn't really know about SNCC and their involvement with the black people in Lowndes County. I mean, a lot of people knew about the Selma to Montgomery March over and what happened at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but that story hadn't been told. So when my co-director, Geeta, reached out to me and said, there's this story about SNCC going into Lowndes County to help the black people empower them to vote, I was surprised. I said, I don't really know that story. And I thought I knew all the stories about the struggle. So it wasn't a story I think that was extremely well known. And this documentary gave us an opportunity to really explore it and really dig into it and really have people understand, in this country, the impact of SNCC back in the 60s. I mean, those who know the civil rights movement all know about the SCLC and Dr. King and Whitney Young and the NAACP and Roy Wilkins, but not many people really know about what was going on with Stokely and Cortland Cox and James Foreman, and Cleveland Sellers. So this was an eye-opener for, I think, me as a filmmaker and as a person who studied the movement and for people who hadn't known about it,
So my children, they watched it with me the first time, and my daughter tried to guess what was going to happen, and then she was like, "Mama, the Black Panther Party." I said, "Watch it, girl." That's what I told her. Next, I wanted to talk about the relevancy of the fight for equality. In what ways do you see the struggles chronicled in your film echoing today?
It's so clear when you watch this film. I hadn't seen it in quite a while, but listen, the things that we're seeing that's happening in America is still happening. It was happening back then, So, you just open the window and you say, oh, this happened back in 1966, 67. Look what's going on in 2025. I mentioned to you earlier today, what Trump is doing now, you can go all the way back to Woodrow Wilson when he was president, and he basically was purging the federal government of black people then. So this history is always repeating itself, coming around and around. And the challenge that we face as people of color, or anybody who's believing in the democratic power, you got to fight the fight. You got to protest. You got to call your congressman. You got to call your senator. You got to be challenging this system. And I mean, the other way is to have a revolution, armed struggle. And you never know where these things can happen. But when I watched this film tonight, I said, man, it's like a mirror, seeing the same thing over and over again. 2 steps up, 3 steps back. 2 steps up, 3 steps back. But that's the challenge of a democracy. That's the challenge you face with a democracy.
So I have one last question. I see some of my classmates, so I wanted to just touch on your creative process. Documentaries tend to evolve as footage and interviews come together. Can you walk us through a key moment when you had to adjust your approach in this film?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that you have to confront when you're making documentaries, particularly historical documentaries, is creating the narrative unfolding, the storytelling. Because I don't think of myself as a historian. I'm a storyteller. So I'm trying to always figure out, when I'm shaping these films, how do I tell the story? How do I keep the audience engaged? How do I get across the information in an engaging way? But how do I make sure you understand the history? So for example, we introduced SNCC going into Lowndes County. But it was important for the audience to have a context of who was SNCC and where did they come from. So we used some music transition. We used that title card, 1960, I forget the date, to take you back to how SNCC began, 1960, with the sit-in movement. So you understood where SNCC came from. Then we went back to Lowndes County, right? And then, as we were looking at what was going on in Lowndes County with Stokely and Cortland Cox and Judy Richardson being there, then we wanted to take you back to what was happening in other parts of the country. So we went to 64, when the Mississippi Democratic Party went to Atlanta to try to make sure they could sit down with the Democratic Party and from this delegation from Mississippi. So again, we were trying to figure out how to thread the needle to give you the past at the same time as we were projecting forward, which was tricky. It was tricky. The first couple of times we did it, it really didn't work. And we said, oh my God, we got to figure this out. And that's always the creative challenge when you're making a documentary. How do you, present the information, keep the audience engaged, create the context, and then knowing how to get out. And the thing, that I always say that's really the thing about a documentary when you construct it well, because it's about construction. If you construct it well, the audience won't feel those bumps, if you do it well, unless you purposely want them to have the bumps, and that wasn't the case with this film. As I watched this film tonight, I thought, wow, this is very well paced, very well constructed, if I say so myself.
So I did see how you transitioned from the beginning to the end based on the strategies that you shared with me. But I would like to open it up to the audience.
Let me say something else. The process of also creating a documentary is one of collaboration. And you can't make these films if you think you can do it all yourself and if it's only your point of view. You have to really take into account, in this case, my co-director, Geeta Gandbhir. You have to take into account your producers. You have to take into account, your cinematographer, your sound person, because all of these collaborators help you shape the story, help you find the point of view, the direction of the filmmaking. And sometimes in this process, in this creative process, since you're not alone, there's tensions, there's disagreements, and you have to figure out how to deal with those disagreements and those tensions. And I'll give you a great example, then you can open up to the audience. The last person in this film is Ruby Sales, right? And she says, we didn't know we were going to go into a burning house. whoa. When we first put that together and our editor put that in, I was the only one of the collaborators who said, that's too incendiary. We can't end like that. I wanted to be on a more optimistic note. And my collaborators all disagreed with me. But initially I was firm about my no, we can't end with Ruby Sales. No. That's gonna really be like a downer. But after a while, after looking at it and rethinking how to get to that statement from Ruby, I came to agree with them, that it was a way to really give you a different perspective on what this experience means to be a person of color in America. You know, the challenges we face and that we constantly still face, you know. So I did come around, but that's just part of this creative process. You're not isolated, you're not making the film by yourself, you got collaborators, and sometimes you have to find, sometimes you come to understanding another person's point of view, and you understand sometimes the importance of compromise. So I felt I needed to say that. Now you can open it up.
Thank you. So, first of all, I have to say, like, wow. It's an incredible documentary.
Thank you.
And I love your work as an editor in the past. Star Wars is my favorite documentary of all time.
Thank you.
And I just want to ask, how is it, you've directed this project, you've directed a lot of projects. How is it being on the director side of the director-editor relationship for this project specifically?
That's an excellent question. You know, when I was an editor, one of the reasons that I decided I wanted to become a director is because I would always, not always, but sometimes I would get material from directors, footage, interviews, B-roll, archival footage and other things. I would complain. I would always complain. Say, oh man, this director didn't ask the right question. Oh my God. And the answer wasn't as incisive or detailed enough. Oh my God, what were they thinking? I would complain and complain and complain. I said, man, when I get out there and direct, I'm going to be 100 times better. I'm going to ask the right questions. I'm going to shoot the right footage. I'm going to do it right. Okay, I've been editing for like 14 years. I get an opportunity to get hired to do Eyes on the Prize 2, right? I get hired as a director/editor on one of 2 shows. And I was putting together the first show, the first time I went out and did interviews with people, and I was like terrified. I said, oh my God, this is hard to ask people questions to get answers. And then I was in the editing room putting it together and cutting it, and we screened, my co-director and I screened for Henry Hampton, who was the executive producer and the creator of Eyes on the Prize, a brilliant man. And we screened our show for him and our other comrades who were directing the other episodes. And after our screening, Henry called me and my co-director into his office, and he said, that cut was awful. He said it was terrible. And he said it was not only badly directed, but your editing was terrible. I was completely insulted, and I was hurt. And he said to me, you know, maybe you're not a director. Maybe you should just be an editor and let someone else have the vision. And he said, think about it for the weekend. So I did, and I came back. I was living in New York on the weekend. Came back to Boston because we were working in Boston, and I went to Henry's office and I said, "Can we afford to hire an editor? Because I won't edit anymore. Because my ego was like, I'm going to show him I can direct." So I became a director. But I'm going to fast forward to last week, 2 weeks ago. I'm directing a documentary now about the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Lorraine Motel. And we went there in July and shot about 6 or 7 interviews. We went back in October and we shot additional 6 interviews. And we put a cut together and we need to do some pickups. We screened it for the producers. They gave us notes. We were needing to do some pickups. And so my editor said, you know, I really want you to get this from these pickup interviews. I want this kind of shot. I want this, I want that. I said, okay, and we took the notes. And I was going to shoot a little verite scene with this lady whose grandfather was the owner of the Lorraine Motel. And in one of their rooms, they had a bed that was called the honeymoon suite. And she had told us that that bed, they had saved that bed and she had it in her house. And I wanted to shoot her in the house, walking up the steps, walking into the bedroom, showing us the bed. So 2 weeks ago, we're in Memphis, and we go to her house. We follow her up the steps with my cameraman. We shoot her going into the room, shooting the bed. Then I say to Henry, my cameraman, Henry, give me a wide shot of the bed when she's out of the frame. So Henry does that. We shoot a couple more takes with her walking up, showing us the bed, talking about the bed. And then we send the footage a few days later to my editor. She sends me a text 3 days ago, and she says, I'm very disappointed in your footage in the bedroom. You didn't get any close-ups. You didn't get any details. I'm disappointed. And I was like, what? How could she? So now the shoe was on the other foot. And you always, and it's not, and that wasn't the first time that an editor said to me, you didn't ask the right question. You didn't get the right answer. So it's tricky, that director-editor relationship. I try not to lose my temper. I try to be, you're right, Fetty, I didn't get that. But we can always go back and get some pickup shots. The director-editor relationship is like a marriage, So you have to know how to deal with your wife or your husband.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate that answer, and I really appreciate you kind of opening up about having to both kind of the tensions that are always there in collaboration, and also having to constantly learn how to humble yourself. I think especially—
That's a great word, humble.
I think especially as like a young filmmaker starting, it's something I always have to learn all of the time, and I know I'm going to have to continue to learn forever. But I was really, really interested in, you have so much archival footage in there, and I think, if I'm not mistaken from the credits, some footage that is not archival but is made to look like it, which, if so, that was done very, very well. I couldn't tell until I saw actors at the end. But I was wondering, how do you go about kind of navigating so many different archives? I imagine there's public and there's private and there's so many different places you're pulling from. How do you navigate having to work with these archives and also just the sheer amount of footage that you're looking at?
Well, the first thing you should always do when you get a budget and you get ready to start your film in pre-production is hire an archival producer, someone who's very seasoned and experienced in dealing with different archival houses, from ABC to CBS to independent archives to personal archives. Make sure you find an archival producer. And then what I do as a director/producer, I'll put together a very extensive archival list that I'm looking for, the kind of stuff I'm looking for, when we're getting ready to go into production, and then I'll give that list to the archival producer and have them start to do the search. That's number 2. Number 3, what I also do now, if I'm shooting in some place like Memphis or in Alabama, I will ask my subjects, do they have personal archives? Do they have stills? Do they have any audio recordings? Did someone shoot footage on Super 8 or with a video camera? Because those are other assets we can use. Now, the big challenge for an archival producer is when they go to these sources for archival, you try to figure out, when you start to use that material, what is it going to cost to put it into your film? Because archival houses charge a lot of money now. And sometimes they will charge you by the second and by the minute, And one of the challenges we face sometimes is that if you find like 10 different sources in terms of archival houses, that's 10 different sources that are going to have different rates in terms of what the expense is. So what you try to do sometimes is you may be working with 10 archival houses initially, but you try to see if you can figure out if there's 1 or 2 or 3 archival houses that may have similar material that you can use that will make you have the ability to use less archival houses, which would bring down the expense. Because the more you use a certain amount of archival footage from one particular house, they'll give you a better rate. So if you use 6 minutes from a CBS, they'll give you a better rate if you're only going to use 2 minutes, or NBC or even Getty, that also works with stills. If you use stills, a number of stills from one particular place like Getty, they'll give you a better rate if you're going to use only 1 still or 2 stills. So you have to keep thinking like that. So it's both thinking creatively and also thinking practically, in terms of how to use archival, And in this case, you're right. We went down to Lowndes County and we rented a couple of period cars, and we used these guys. The actors are basically drivers to drive. When you saw the shot of the person looking in the rearview mirror, that was one of our actors. You see the car driving the road, that was one of our actors. We used drone shots. We had a drone person come in, and we did a lot of those drone shots up the highway, on the road, going into the house, But we tried to make sure it didn't feel like you were watching drone shots or you were watching our footage. And that was the challenge. And we changed a lot of that stuff to black and white,
Hi, I'm Abby.
Hey, Abby.
I wanted to know really about what was it like sitting with those white women that you talked to? How did you get them to open up so honestly?
Geeta did those interviews, and these ladies, we knew that we wanted to hear from the white perspective, and I think Van Newkirk knew these ladies because he was one of the initiators of the project, and Geeta, she's a very seasoned producer, and she makes the important thing about when you interview people is you want to make them feel comfortable. You don't want to be like an inquisition. You want to sit there with them. And did I say this to you today about being conversational? You want to try to be conversational. It's not like you want to sit there with your questions and say, so how did it feel to be a white person in Alabama in 1960? No. You want to make it conversational. You want to just have a dialogue. And I try not to, and Geeta's the same way, I try not to have my questions right in front of me. I will read over my questions, read over the backgrounds of the people I'm going to interview. So when I walk into the room, I'm cordial, I shake your hand, I'll sit down. One of the first things I say is, don't get uptight, relax, take a deep breath. This is just going to be a conversation, And if you have a question, just feel free to ask me. If you're concerned about an answer that you may be uncomfortable about, let me know. And and that's what I do. And and I've been interviewing people now since 1987. And at this stage in my career, I feel very comfortable talking to people. Now, quite honestly, I got into being an editor because I was nervous about people. I was shy. At 22, 23, I couldn't sit here and talk. I barely talked from 23 to 29, I would never talk. That's why the editing was such a comfortable haven for me. I could go into a dark room, I could cut, nobody would talk to me unless I had to talk to the director. It was great. But when I became a director, as I got older, I just became more comfortable within my own skin.
That was a really, really powerful documentary, and I agree with you. It is well constructed.
Thank you, sir.
And I think my question is, what was maybe the total length of time that it took to sort of make this documentary? And also, what are a few scenes that almost made it that you sort of think about, maybe I should have put that in there?
The whole film, from pre-production through production to post, took about a year. Now, before that, there's always a part about trying to raise the money to do it, and that took about a year. And so I would say the whole film itself took about 2 years, and that's pretty good because most times these things can take 4 years, 5 years. I'd finished a film right after this that I've been working on for 30 years about Max Roach, jazz musician and activist. It took me 30 years to finish that one, So this one was pretty fast. Now, the answer to your second question is, I don't remember anything that I would have put in. I have amnesia, When I finish a film, I'm done. I don't think, I should have put this scene in, I don't think that way. I've done the job, I've got to the place where I'm pretty happy with it, and I move on. So I never ever once think, oh, I should have put that scene in, I missed. I don't do that. I never do that to myself, you know. Then that's why I've survived so long.
What made you think of Lowndes County? I hadn't even ever heard of that before.
It wasn't me. It was a gentleman named Van Newkirk who worked for the Atlantic, and another gentleman named Dema. They came up with the idea. They had written an article about it. I think Van had written an article in the Atlantic, and he approached Geeta and the company Multitude about doing a film. It wasn't my idea, you know. And I initially said I didn't want to be involved. You know, I was sort of tired of doing civil rights films. But when I got into it, I started doing the research. I said, whoa. You know, and the thing that I always love about making documentaries is engaging with people. Just spending time down in Lowndes County, talking to all these wonderful people, it was just exhilarating for me, you know.
I just have a question. In terms of like the locals, kind of brushing on what she said, how did you find all of these locals who maybe weren't necessarily like really public faces of the movement to interview?
What you do is you have your producers or your associate producer go into these places and start to talk to people. Talk to people about who remembers the history of Lowndes County. Is there someone we could talk to about it? Do you think they'll be comfortable on camera? It's really research. Research is such a vital part of this process, you know, and if you do your research well, you know, you can find people, you know, and people usually are open to talking about the particular subject that they're familiar with. So we didn't have much difficulty finding people at all. And I usually find that's the case with most of these docs that I've worked on. People are always open about talking about things that they know about, or history that they were a part of, or history that their family members might have been a part of. So it wasn't difficult. It wasn't difficult. Sometimes the most difficult thing is trying to figure out if it's a story, how to visualize it. You know, I was talking to a young man today about his grandfather who had a mortuary, and I was saying to him, how are you going to tell a story? You know, he was telling me what he was going to find, but then I said, maybe you should go in, because his parents still have a mortuary. I said, you should go and you shoot your family now at the mortuary as a frame to tell that story, you know. So you just have to be, in my experience, you have to be a real go-getter, you know, and you have to be on what I call a mission dedicated to figuring out how to tell a story. Tenacity is a valuable thing when you're making documentaries. Tenacity. Sandra's got the last question.
Okay, all right.
I'm excited. So I had a bonus question for this morning that I didn't get to ask. What's the most valuable piece of advice that you've received or discovered from telling underrepresented stories in documentary film?
The most valuable piece of advice I ever got was from a filmmaker named St. Clair Bourne, who was a major mentor to me. And he said to me when I was 30 years old, he said, Sam, we have a responsibility to tell our stories as filmmakers of color. We have a responsibility, and never underestimate that importance. And from that point on, I knew that many of the films that I was going to be involved with, either as an editor or as a director, producer, was telling our stories. Because, you know, I always want people to know that our stories are part of the American story. And if you don't understand that, then you don't know what it means to be an American, as far as I'm concerned. Because I grew up at a time where, you know, as a young man in 1964, I was told, don't think about being a black person, Sam. Just become a part of the American melting pot. Forget being a person of color. That's not true. You can't forget who you are and where you come from. And that's a part of my mantra, even to this day. Thank you all for coming out. Really appreciate it.